The best salespeople are the most creative out there. They're seeing a blocker and they're thinking of a way around it. They're hitting a challenge. Maybe they're doing outbound calling and they can't get through. So what do they do next? How do they think around it? How do they come up with a new idea? And I think if you see it in that way, which is I've got these challenges I'm going to overcome, then I think it sounds a lot more exciting than you've just got to monotonously work through all these numbers.
Welcome to Scale Sessions, the podcast that helps revenue leaders like you boost sales and revenue to achieve business growth within the trenches insights.
We can skip the fluff and focus on real-world strategies you can use right away.
Each episode brings you actionable takeaways from sales and revenue leaders navigating growth challenges like you. Let's dive into today's session and scale up your success. Hello, Sophie. How is Chamonix? Absolutely no jealousy from this side at all right now.
Hi, Nicola. Hi, Tom. Chamonix is beautiful and sunny today.
Have you been out on the slopes?
Well, not today. No, unfortunately, I've been working, but I was skiing yesterday, so can't complain.
Tom, do you ski?
I did when I was younger, but every time I have the idea of going, and I think we want to take the kids for the first time, my wife, Shelley, kind of poo-poos it because it's cold, or in her head thinks it's cold, so we end up going somewhere hot. So I'm working on that one. But no, I do like skiing. It's great fun. What made you move out there, Sophie? What was the catalyst for you going, I'm going to go live abroad?
So, I did a ski season after uni and I loved living in the mountains so much. And I sort of told myself, I promised myself that I would try and get back here one day. And so after kind of many years of working away in London, I realized that I was spending most of my time on Zoom. And so I thought, well, hang on a minute, I could be doing that from Chamonix. So I moved out here and that was about 6-7 years ago and I haven't looked back.
I do love that though, because how often do we say, one day I'm going to do this or live here? And you've actually done it, which I think is amazing.
Well, on reflection, it was probably a fairly risky and stupid decision because I didn't think it through very much. I'd never been to Chamonix before when I moved out here and I didn't know anyone here, but it's worked out. So maybe there's a lesson there somewhere.
And Tom, we did actually discuss at a pavilion dinner last year doing a pavilion ski trip. We had quite a lot of interest, but then by the time we started thinking about it, it was May. So I think we actually need to start planning it for next year because I do think that would be a great weekend.
So Sophie can be your host. So
we'll all just pile into the new place, Sophie. I'm sure that's absolutely fine to have a load of revenue leaders piled on the floor.
Yeah, I just bought a house recently. I'm not sure I can fit everyone from Pavilion in, but I'll give it a go.
Right, that's my goal, 2026. Pavilion ski trip at Sophie's. Love it.
It's a good one.
Do you know what else I was noticing on because I went all the way to the bottom of your CV. Your first job was at Kantar. Yeah.
Yeah, it was NFO World Group back in the day, but it kind of, it got acquired a few times.
I've never worked in that industry, but I feel like I know a shit ton about it because one of our larger customers is Cision, the media company. And then the whole people who work to Meltwater and Kantar, as a raft of people I know who left there and then have brought Jiminy over the years, and just by association and names, and then I don't know, I just feel like I know that industry really well, which is funny. But that's where you started out. Yeah.
Well, it's kind of a bit of it's sort of a bit of an origin story for me because it was my first job, my first graduate job, and they hired everyone into market research. And well, I don't know how they do it now, but back in the day, you had to kind of go through various different stages before you could be released and go and work on accounts. But at the beginning, they profiled all the graduates, and all of the graduates, apart from me, sat on one side where it was very much analytical, sort of more marketing focused. And I was this extreme one on the other side, which was extroverted sales profile. And so at that point, I was like, well, could I be involved in selling the market research? Could I go and be seconded into that department? But they wouldn't let me. They said I had to kind of keep pouring through lines and lines of data until I'd kind of, done it for a couple of years. So I left and went to a graduate sales training program instead.
Smart move. So, you've had an awesome career doing multiple roles, and now you're fractional through to founding multiple businesses. Tell us a little bit about your journey, how you got there, where you started.
Yeah, well, it wasn't really particularly thought through. So I studied geography at university because I liked it, not really thinking about how that might help me get a job. I worked a ski season when I finished uni, and when I was doing that job, so I was a rep, and I was actually responsible for, I had a bunch of sales targets. So I would have to pick customers up from the airport in a coach and take them back to resort. And I had to sell to them lift passes, ski hire, and tuition. And I get really bad car sickness. So I had to try and hit all of the bus. I had to sell to the whole coach before the coach started going up the mountain and going into the sort of windy hairpins, because otherwise I'd have just been being sick all over everyone. So it kind of made me really focused. And I realized I was actually quite good at sales and I really enjoyed it. And I really enjoyed hitting a target. So I sort of brought that back with me when I was, looking for a real job when I got back from living in the French Alps. And then I guess I ended up as a sales graduate at Microsoft, and I worked in the corporate world for 10 years and learnt a lot. But I increasingly felt frustrated about the politics and how decisions were made, and how it felt like you were sort of just supposed to do what was expected of you rather than come up with new ideas of how you might do things differently. So at that point, I decided to give it a go and kind of go and work in startups and see if what I'd learned in the corporate world could transfer to helping a sort of much earlier stage business build out their sales operations. It went really well. I realized that it was kind of really motivating, because actually if you hit a target in a startup, it might mean something like you could guarantee the company's salaries for a year, as opposed to just, well, you're in the corporate world, you've hit a target and so what. And then from there, I just decided that I really enjoyed working with that stage of business, helping them think through how to build out their commercial operations, and also helping them, I guess, navigate their way through those common challenges that early stage businesses can really struggle with. And if they can fast track their way through them, they can have a sort of much quicker path to success. And so that, I guess, takes me to where I am today.
So with the ski repping work, you actually learned how to sell very succinctly as well, because what was that time window before you started going up the mountain that you had to nail your sales pitch in?
Well, it depended. It wowould depend on the traffic, depended on the time. If it was February school holidays, you might have a little bit longer. So I was always quite happy with that. But I'd have to try and get around the coach. I mean, this was back in the day, Nicola, when there was no such thing as like having a little point of sale unit where someone could tap their phone. I had a clipboard.
The old clipboard, I remember this.
And that paper where I had to like put the credit card underneath the paper and rub my biro against it to get an imprint of the card. And I was doing that walking around the coach with the coach going around corners. So
some people will be listening going, what is she on about?
Whereas I'm like, I remember that.
Yeah.
I'm really aging myself, aren't I? I'm not helping myself here. But yeah, so it certainly made me focused on getting to the point. I had to pitch to the person or the coach why it was valuable for them that I was going to go and make their ski pass up for them the next day, rather than then getting up and having to go and queue. And so you had to hone your pitch. And I felt that was a really good early lesson for me.
Yeah, absolutely. Given that everyone else had the entire ride to the resort and you probably had like the first 40 minutes, unless it was holidays. Brilliant. Do you think you always were planning to work for yourself and have your own consultancy?
I would love to say that it was premeditated, Nicola, but no, I think, I sort of got here through sort of, a meandering route. I guess the more I started working with startups, the more I realized that I like to, it was really motivating for me to work with businesses where I felt like what they were doing mattered, and working with really motivated, founding teams. And so being able to set up my own business, consulting business, and being a little bit more selective about who I worked with was something that I was really passionate about. And so I sort of fell into it, gave it a go, and then, I haven't looked back since.
Sophie, you said something that I'm really intrigued by. You said often the leadership team will misdiagnose the problem in sales. And so you almost have to unpick the belief that this is what's wrong and this is where they need to focus. What are the most common misconceptions about what's going wrong?
I think that's a hard one, because it really does depend. But I find that often, perhaps it's the founder or whoever's responsible for revenue in the business. It might be one of their board, one of their investors. Typically, they have more comfort in one area than the other. So I often find between sales and marketing, they might have more of a sales background or more of a marketing background, or just more comfort in one or the other. And so they'll tend to kind of lean into the one that they know and understand better. And it doesn't mean that isn't something worth focusing on. But, that's why I just think that sort of 360 review is so important because, and often actually something that seems to be the problem is actually just, it's just the symptom of, the deeper problem. And so it's about trying to really kind of dig into that root cause. I mean, I think sometimes people, might say something sweeping like, my sales team are rubbish. They're not hitting their targets. I need to fire them all and get new. I mean, I'm being a little bit extreme here, but and sometimes actually, it is about looking into the team, and maybe they are absolutely the right team, the right skill set, but maybe they're not set up for success. Or alternatively, they might be selling B2B enterprise software and they've got someone who perhaps is much better suited to a higher turnover, maybe sort of more transactional sales. Nothing wrong with that person. Maybe they're just not set up for success because they've got the wrong background.
Yeah, it's often how people are managed, and by that it's managed to be doing the right things or put into the right place. We were talking before we came on air about tricky founders, but as I'm the only founder on the call, well-ish, I think you have too. But the thing is, when you have a business for a long time, you can become blinded too. And if you don't think you know everything about the market, everything about the competition, you have too much knowledge, and therefore you can become, kind of blinkered about certain things. So that's when the business is trying to get to another stage or another chapter, I think that's where it can be really powerful too.
And we all have our unconscious bias and the safe space. Like, this is where I feel really comfortable. And so I think it's so important to bring in a third party who's just got a completely objective view on it.
Yeah, and I think that, to be clear, I don't want to founder bash here. I've worked with brilliant founders, and I think that it's a really tough job, right? You've got to have a vision, you've got to see it through. You're, drumming up. You've got to drum up interest, both, to get people to join you on your mission as part of your team, but also get investment and whatever it might be. But I don't think it's just founders. I think, when I've been in a business owning that, full time, I get blinkered as well, so it is just that sort of ability to come in with a fresh pair of eyes, but also a fractional leader or someone coming in and doing a project. Often they're seeing lots of these things happening across different businesses and different sectors and different types of and structures. So they can actually bring lots of different ideas and points of views. Or I've seen another business handle this in this way. Maybe we could try that. You're not going to get to do that because you're so focused on your one business.
Sophie, we've talked quite a lot in the past about why are there so few women in sales leadership, and particularly in B2B enterprise and SaaS? How does this affect the broader perception of sales, and why are women's skills so well suited for these roles, yet we don't seem to be attracting them?
It's a kind of age-old debate, isn't it? I think, and I don't think it's just sales leadership, Nicola, actually. I think it's sales across the board. I often help my clients hire into their sales teams, and just, that you get so fewer female profiles coming through for any type of sales role. I think it's a combination of things. Certainly when I was coming up in my career, I was often the only woman in the sales team. In fact, when I joined Nokia, the UKMD brought me in as his controlled experiment of one to put a woman into the sales team to see how it changed the dynamics. And, I found myself in the Monday sales meeting dealing with a hugely testosterone charged, ego-driven environment and trying to kind of figure out my place in that. Now, I grew up with two older brothers. I had a father who was really encouraging of me, always saying, I think you can do anything a man can do, and so I was really able to hold my own in that environment, but it wasn't easy. And, so why, I imagine a lot of women might say, well, why would I do that? When I can go and work in a different team where perhaps it's better suited, or it feels less combative, it feels less tense. So I think that sales cultures are really important to look at. I mean, I hope it's less of a thing, but I still think there's that sense of the boys club, and women, sort of can't fit into that. I mean, I was reading a stat the other day that said something like women perform 1.5 times better than men on average in sales roles. But then when you look at the number of women in sales versus men, you've got this complete kind of discrepancy. So I think that these perceptions really need changing. So are job descriptions written in a way that encourage women to apply? Are we setting up the right environment and culture within sales teams to make sure that it makes people feel comfortable? Are we valuing the right skills and the right behaviors, right? So is it the person that shouts the loudest, or, is it the person that's thoughtfully thinking through a problem? I mean, you asked about the kind of like the sort of skill sets of women. I think that it does, it's a bit of a stereotype, but I think, women are in general better empathizing and generally better at listening. And those, I think, are the two kind of greatest skills you need as a salesperson to really understand the person that you're selling to, rather than what you want to say to them, listening to what they have to say to you.
It was always seen as, oh, you're a salesperson. When I started off, it's not a professional career, right? That old kind of thing. I think that's changed a lot now, but I think people think it's more monotonous and boring than it actually is. I think people go, I don't want to go in and just do the same thing every time and but every job has its repeatable things. And any job, you can be creative with how you do it. But I think there's some perception things with sales that stops people go, like women, because they want to do different things. They want to be creative more. They put a label on sales sometimes.
I think you said something really interesting there, though. I think sales can be incredibly creative, and yet we don't ever put it in that bucket. I think we still have it in a sort of 90s bucket of, always be closing.
You're both talking, like, this is exactly what I always talk about, which is I think we need to reframe it as a creative role. The best salespeople are the most creative out there. They're seeing a blocker and they're thinking of a way around it. They're hitting a challenge. Maybe they're doing outbound calling and they can't get through. So what do they do next? How do they think around it? How do they come up with a new idea? And I think if you see it in that way, which is, I've got these challenges I'm going to overcome, then I think it sounds a lot more exciting than, you've just got to like monotonously work through all these numbers. But you're right. Like I was talking to someone the other day who was saying that like they're help recruiting graduates, and they're trying to understand why, once again, women are less likely to go into more of the sort of sales type roles. And we were talking about lack of self-confidence. And I think that, once again, I'm sorry, because I know these are huge like generalizations, but often men tend to be overconfident on their abilities, and women underplay them. And so women typically only go for a role when they feel like they've hit it and they've proven that they've done it many times over, whereas men will stretch themselves and go for the next thing and back themselves to do it. And I think if we can help women feel more confident and more assertive, then hopefully that will open up those sales roles. And importantly, coming back to what you said, Nicola, those sales leadership roles, which I think benefit greatly from having some of those female softer, dare I say it, skills in there around, looking after the team and really helping develop the all of the, men and women in their sales team.
I think we need to do a rebrand for sales. And even like little things, like if someone says they work in business development, everyone goes, oh, cool. If people say I work in sales, it doesn't have the same resonance, and often it's the same thing. It's just that brand. You very rarely see people say, I want to go into sales, unless they say, I really want to make a lot of money. That's what it relates to.
Oh, well, and actually often when I interview salespeople, I'll often ask them, what their path was to getting into sales. And 9 times out of 10, I would say it was a non-conscious decision. They sort of fell into it in one way or another. And, I always say, I go the other way, right? I always say to people, I'm a sales geek. I unashamedly, I love it. I think it's an amazing career. I'm so proud of it. I'm excited to be a part of it. And I think that, I've seen it to the extent where startups will try and hire salespeople, but they won't call them salespeople. So they're trying to get those skills in. They need someone who's going to be target driven, motivated by hitting their targets and earning their commission, and resilient, right? Because, Tom, you hit on this, like it's tough, right? You have targets. There are consequences if you don't hit them. There are great things that come with hitting them, but if you don't hit them, then you tend to suffer consequences. And so resilience in sales is really important. I always joke that you've got to be good at being rejected, right? We've got to be great at rejection in sales, and we've got to, back to that point about thinking around a problem and being creative. But if we're trying to hire someone into a sales team and not calling them a salesperson, you're not going to get those skills in. So it's a kind of this vicious cycle.
As a founder, as a CEO, and it's funny that, most people have an opinion on how you could sell more. Yeah, even if they're in different departments or different teams. But, a sales leader wouldn't go around and tell them how to code faster or, build something better. But everyone seems to be able to have an opinion on it, so it's that thing as well. It works the other way.
Well, that's true, because you're always there. Your results are there to be scrutinized, aren't they? Because, either you're hitting your revenue targets or you're not. And I have experienced that many times as well, Tom, and I try and turn it around and make it, so sales is everyone's job in the business. It's not actually just the sales team. And whether it's actually what do we need to be doing within the product to help it, create differentiation, or how are we onboarding customers and creating great customer loyalty so that we've got these great stories to bring back into sales and marketing. But either way, I'm really keen to emphasize that it's everyone's responsibility within the organization.
And Sophie, you do a lot of coaching with first-time managers, those progressing up. Do you have any advice for revenue leaders about how best to coach their team as they progress them internally?
That's a good question. I think one of the things I've noticed that gets strangely overlooked a lot in sales teams is actual sales coaching. So I think often as a sales leader, obviously they have a lot of pressure from above and to deliver on their results. And so when they're interacting with their team, it's about, what results have you got? How are your deals progressing? Like what's happening, as opposed to looking into the areas where they might need support and development, and taking the time to actually look at the individual's development needs, as well as what might need to happen at a team level. So I think things like don't skip the one-to-ones. It's something that often does just get moved out of the diary. And my view is never move it. It's sacrosanct. Now it's the one time a week where you get to interact with the person in your team and understand what's going on with them. And then also, do that individual level of sales coaching, because that's where you can get the best, the sort of the biggest movement in results in terms of driving performance for the team, but also making sure you're really getting the best out of that individual.
That's a great point. And I think often when you sit down, it sounds like you're really passionate about the coaching side, not just since you've been doing that more. I believe a lot of the time it's mental. How you can be the best at sales, it's all up here. Can you leave it at the door? Can you be fully focused? Can you do the repeatable things well? Almost like sport, like a muscle that you train. And I think when you have those one-to-ones, are you thinking about it from, did you follow this qualification criteria of medic on every call? Or actually it's Jane, how are you feeling this week? What's going on? And actually are you blocking the thing? I'm not saying you have to be a therapist, because no, but that's, the coaching is really understanding people and trying to get the best out of them and taking the things out their way that would stop them being good, not necessarily just the skill bit.
Tom, I couldn't agree more. I have a really, really simple one-to-one format that I always share with my teams. And the first question is, how are you feeling today? And they can put a score or they can put an emoji. And it's amazing how just starting the conversation with that uncovers things that helps you really understand how they need support. And even those, you have all sorts of personalities in a sales team, some who feel like, everything's fine. But if you sort of go, no, let's not skip past this one. How's it going? It really is useful to kind of understand what's going on behind the scenes.
But talking about these points, Sophie, what does a healthy sales culture look like? And how can sales leaders bring this into the organization?
This is something that I feel very passionate about. And I think it's so important to consciously design the sales culture that's right for the organization. So one, it does need to fit with the overall company culture. So it can't be hugely clashing. Having said that, it is absolutely okay for it to be slightly different because, we've already talked about the fact that sales teams have targets, have important metrics. There are consequences to kind of hitting or achieving certain things. I think a healthy sales culture, and I emphasize the word healthy, is one that is competitive. Absolutely. That's why we don't hire one rep, we hire two at the same time so they can have this kind of healthy, competition and like, oh, what do they do? Oh, that's interesting. They've done more calls than me today. I better get on the phone or whatever it might be. But I think it's so important that it's healthy, right? So not competition at all costs. So, matching that up with things like collaboration, making sure that teams are encouraged and frankly, I think incentivized to work together. I'm a firm believer that salespeople will behave in the way that their compensation is structured. Let's just be realistic about it. No one turns up and just does things out of the goodness of their own heart. Well, maybe they do, but let's design for it, right? So have individual targets, but have something that points towards a team target or a way of encouraging people to work together. But I think my top tip around a healthy sales culture is don't create the culture yourself as the sales leader, have your team co-create it. And that makes the biggest difference because actually if they're sitting there asking themselves, what kind of culture would I like to work in? What do I think would be, competitive and results driven, but also a fun, collaborative environment to work in, they'll come up with the values that you want to see. And then importantly, they will self-regulate. They'll hold each other accountable because if it's just you trying to drive that, it's a tough and lonely place to be. Whereas if everyone is feeling accountable for that, and you'll find yourself on in a team call and someone might start kind of like going off track a bit and their teammate will pull them back, like, hang on a minute, we said we were going to do this. So it's actually great because everyone's working on it together.
Like for me, I see this the other day, like new customer signs where title is sales manager, sales director, and Nicola was talking about, how do we redefine the title so it sounds better? Like you hit on a really great point, Sophie. Like the job of a modern sales leader is not like you're like a head coach, right? Like we talk about this all the time, like why the modern sales team changes. They're a connector of people. Can you get the team to be diverse? Can you get them to support each other? Can you develop them? Whereas the old school approach, probably when we all started sales, was like, mate, my dad was probably the age of most sales managers, like dictatorial, top down, get it done, work in silos. Whip. Yeah. Some things work well in that thing, and other things don't. But the world's changed. But it's like in football, they don't call it a manager anymore; they call it a head coach. Why? Because they're there to get the best out of the team. If you look at any Premier League team, it's very rare they call it a manager anymore. But we don't change it in B2B, which is like, but it's not actually the title. It's not actually the job. It's labelled wrong, I think.
How do you actually get your team involved in it? Because I find so often it says we're going to create this together and then you sort of get stuck. Well, how are we actually going to go about putting this into place? And then how are we going to measure that this is actually working and that we're sticking to this? Because so often these wonderful kind of ideas about how to run the culture, workshops done, and then it's sort of put in a drawer and forgotten about. So how do you actually live and breathe it as well?
Yeah, so it's a really good point. So I do think it helps to workshop it out, but I think it helps to have someone facilitating that. Not trying to do a plug for myself, but that's something that I often
you need
do.
Sophie.
I do often help with that. But then but it's so, as I said, it's about accountability. So what I would suggest is that if you list out a bunch of values that we want to see as part of our sales culture, have someone responsible for each one of those values, right? So for the next quarter, Mary is going to be responsible for this piece around teamwork or whatever it might be, and then agree some actions below that. So and it's not all on Mary to fix it. We're all going to help her, but she's going to be the one that's going to try and drive that action through. Then when you have your team meetings or your kind of team check-ins, then each, person responsible for each value is going to report on that. It might be stating the obvious here, but it also does need to be led from the front. Like the sales leader, the commercial leader needs to live and breathe those values too. It is not okay to just have, expect that of the team. And so, the very best sales leaders are going to be the ones that will, put in the hard work and represent that as well. So I think it needs to kind of come from everyone.
So we got to finish with some quick fire questions. Yeah. Like we always do. So if in your career, what's the biggest thing you felt you've learned Sophie?
Oh, that's interesting. I think probably trust your gut and take risks. And I'm probably, when I decided to leave the corporate world and my well-paid job at Sony, my dad, who'd been a career-long IBMer, was absolutely horrified. He thought I was throwing it all away. And I went and, I took a job in a startup with 50% pay cut, no benefits. The company car was gone, the mobile phone was gone, but it was the best thing I've ever done. And it enabled me to just keep, having the confidence to take on more risk, but then, embrace more opportunity. So I think, just embrace the risk.
What's one belief or perspective you've changed your mind on?
I mean, this is going to sound really boring, but process. So when I was an IC and I was, in my corporate career, I really pushed back against process. Obviously I did. No one likes filling in CRM. No one likes, having to kind of conform into a process. But now when I'm helping businesses think about designing their commercial organizations, their go-to-market functions from the ground up, it's so important to have those great foundational processes to help guide, because otherwise you're never going to get that repeatability and that scalability. And if you want to onboard a rep into a team that's just got zero process, you're going to have a lot harder of a job. So I think it's about embracing the non-sexy process.
Oh, I love a process. I'm with you on that one.
So when you're skiing down the slopes and not working, what's your favourite book or podcast that you'd recommend?
I'm a bit of an origin story geek. So I love the podcast Acquired. Do you know that?
Yeah, I do. Yeah. The big US. It's quite big now. US. It started. Yeah.
So they cover the origin stories of massive brands, and they'll do it over kind of the course of 2 or 3 hours. But I love the way they go into the detail. I love how you hear always such weird and wonderful twists and turns that these people have kind of gone on to get to where they are. But I also think that it always ends up coming back to there's no easy way, right? The founders are working really hard and really determined. And maybe they had a brilliant idea and they were at the right place at the right time, but they got there through, sheer work and determination as well. So yeah, I love it.
Right. I've written that one down. Want to follow. How do you switch off after a busy day?
Well, if it's in the winter and it's the end of the day, I can't get out because it's dark, so I can't go skiing. So I might go climbing at the climbing gym. But I mean, it's always going to be exercise. It's always going to be fresh air if possible. So in the summer, it might be a trail run. It might be cycling up one of the local cols. But it's always getting, that oxygen pumping through and getting that kind of burst of adrenaline.
Thank you so much for joining us, Sophie. And I'm just so impressed with how brave you are. Some really bold moves there. I wish I'd been brave enough to just go, right, off to Chamonix. It's too sensible.
Thanks, Nicola. Thanks, Tom. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for tuning in to Scale Sessions. If you found today's insights valuable, be sure to subscribe and leave a review.
Stay connected for more no-nonsense advice to help you scale your business, drive revenue, and achieve your growth goals.